Welcome everyone to our Kepler College Book Club Author Q&A. My name is Misty Lane and I'm your book club admin. I'm here today with Anthony Lewis, author of our May Book of the Month, Secrets of Predictive Astrology. This book delves into astrologer William Frankland's predictive techniques for a more straightforward and even more accurate forecasting. And I will be keeping an eye on the chat. So everyone watching, please feel free to send in your comments, send in your questions, and I'll be sure to keep an eye out so we can get them answered. So Anthony, can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background and what drew you to studying Franklin's work?
Well, astrology's been an interest practically all of my life. I started when I was fairly young, and I got into horary astrology at some point. I don't remember exactly when. And in reading about horary astrology, I came across a chart Franklin had delineated way back. He was practicing a century ago. And what happened was there was an older man who was having health problems in his hometown, basically. By then, he'd moved to London. This was more northern England or north of London.
Mhm.
And this man was apparently quite depressed, and one night just walked out of the house at 4 in the morning and nobody could find him. And his daughter apparently knew Franklin because they had grown up in the same community, and contacted him in London, knowing he was an astrologer, and said, "Can you help us find my father? He disappeared. We've been looking all weekend. We can't find him." And he did a horary chart. Horary is where you do a chart and answer a question based on the moment you ask the question, the chart for the moment you ask the question. And he also got the father's birth information and looked at the two charts, the horary question and the birth chart of the father, and responded in writing. I guess he must have telegraphed it. This was 1926. And said, "Unfortunately, from the charts, it looks like your father may have died. But he can be found, or at least his body can be found." And then he gave specific directions based on the horary chart. And the woman gave the directions to her husband, who went looking, and following them, it led to the body, which was in a canal in the city. And there was I guess they do a coroner's inquest if somebody dies. And so the story got out in the press that this man went missing, and a few days later, following the directions of an astrologer who was far away in London, the family was able to locate the body. And this story was picked up in the local paper and even in the London papers. It was quite well known in England. And then Geoffrey Cornelius, who's an English astrologer, wrote a book that came out, I think, in the early 1990s, in which he described this incident. And I found that fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided then, it was probably 1994, 95, when I read the book, I have to find out who this William Franklin is and learn more about his methods, because this was very impressive.
Oh, yeah.
But I never really got around to it. It was always in the back of my mind. And finally, during COVID, when I was sort of trapped in the house and couldn't go out much, I decided, well, this is a good time. So I searched for his books. He had published, I think, 3 books, a couple of which I was able to obtain. And they were not so much about horary, but about his natal astrology. And he wrote about how he had learned astrology in the teens, that is the 19 teens, the period of World War I and that before that. And he'd grown frustrated with what was available for predictive techniques. He learned the standard techniques, which were then transits and progressions and directions.
Mhm.
and found that sometimes they worked and worked well, but often he had a very busy practice of clients who wanted to, he would come and want to forecast what do you think is going to happen, or that often things would happen that he would have no clue from the chart, or the chart would indicate probably some major event and then nothing would happen. And so he decided to research, are there other methods? And he began by researching what came to be called symbolic directions. That is not measurements like transits where you're looking at actual positions in the sky at a certain time, or even progressions, which you just move the chart forward at a certain rate in time.
Mhm.
But symbolic in the sense that you would take some arbitrary measure and apply it everywhere in the chart. And he, in his research, came across probably the simplest one of all, 1 degree per year, which goes back to Ptolemy, 2,000 years. And he began applying it to charts and found that it worked very well. He could identify in charts major periods of a person's life in which events would occur just by measuring from a certain point in the chart at 1 degree per year. So if you were 20 years old, he would move everything 20 degrees forward.
Mhm.
Now, he doesn't mention this, but he also got involved in midpoints, which was, I thought, highly unusual for an English astrologer in the early 1900s. They really came up more out of Germany and Alfred Witte and the Hamburg school.
Okay.
But Franklin was using them in his work in the early 1900s, first couple of decades. And he was also measuring from 0 Aries, which is like in cosmobiology or Uranian, a key point in the sky.
Mhm.
And he found that if he measured age from 0 Aries forward by 1 degree per year, that point would often hit a natal planet or natal configuration very exactly the year when a major event occurred. For instance, if
Okay.
someone got married at 25, measuring 25 degrees from Aries might get you to Venus. And so he began looking for other measures like that. And his idea was he needed something simple, quick, and accurate. And he came up with taking the 1 degree per year. He, for sort of theoretical reasons, started taking 4/7 of that measure. Um, so that, say, at age 14, he would use 4/7 of 14 as eight degrees as his symbolic measure and advance everything by 8 degrees. And he found that that hit. His reasoning was more mystical or esoteric, that four is a key number in esoteric studies. Like there are 4 seasons, 4 quadrants of the horoscope, um, 4 phases of the moon, that it seemed to be a key number. And seven obviously is a key number because 7 days of the week, seven visible planets.
Mhm.
And so he found the 4/7 worked very well too. And he would also, when he did this, look at midpoints that it triggered, which was to me a fascinating idea. And I found this works really well. If you practice it on a chart, if you put in your age, take 4/7 of it, and measure that from 0 Aries. So say you're 35 years old. Well, 7 into 35 is 5. 5 times 4 is 20. If I did that right. And so you would start at 0 Aries, you'd be at 20 degrees of Aries, and you'd see what midpoints are close to 20 degrees of Aries, say within a degree at most. And usually those midpoints, say almost always, are highly descriptive of what's going on in your life at that time. And he could do
Mhm.
this quickly in
Absolutely.
his head, and then he also went back to Ptolemy, who had these 7 ages of man that are quite well known. I think you start with the moon for 4 years, and then you go to Venus, to Mercury, where you're going to school learning for 10 years, and then to Venus in your late adolescence when you're learning about relationships and falling in love and so on throughout life. And he found looking at the planets in the natal chart that ruled the age of the person according to Ptolemy's ages was often highly significant. So basically a time lord, we'd say today.
Hmm.
And and he also came across there was something written by Alan Leo in the late 1800s. And Alan Leo had this idea. I don't know if it was his originally or if he got it from somebody, but he certainly described it that he felt that the discovery of the planet Uranus in the late 1700s had opened up a new era for astrology, that we now had to incorporate Uranus into what was known from tradition. And what was striking about Uranus in this theory is that its orbit is about 84 years, almost exactly,
Exactly. Hmm.
which is kind of the lifespan of a human being. So his idea was, what if we project or map the orb of Uranus onto the lifespan, starting again at zero Aries? He always goes back to the zero Aries point. And that would mean that every sign would cover 7 years of life, so that your first 7 years would be governed by Aries in your natal chart. And whatever Aries is doing, that is what house it's ruling and what planets are there, etc., would have a great relevance predictively to your life. And he used that and found that very effective. And in fact, he called the measure there the point of life. He saw life as beginning at zero Aries symbolically, and then progressing through the chart at this rate of one sign for every 7 years of life. And so at age 7, you're entering Taurus. At age 14, you're entering Gemini. At age 21, you're entering Cancer, and so on. And so at mid Cancer, you'd be at 21 plus half of 7 years, which is what, 24 and a half, if I did that right. Yeah. And so he would find this point of life based on the orbit of Uranus in your natal chart. And then if that was hitting something significant, a planet or a midpoint, he would
Hmm.
use that interpretively. Also the house position. And he found that he was getting a lot of hits, accurate hits, and that he could just sit down with a chart and very quickly say, well, around age 13, this might have happened, or something like this, at age 20, something like this. And his clients were quite astounded. And in fact, the preface to one of his books is written by one of his clients who became his student. And this was a young man who went to see him when he was about 24, 25 years old. And this young man had been studying astrology for several years and was growing frustrated because there was a lot of stuff going on in his life and he just couldn't see anything in his chart to correlate with it. And he describes his first visit. He said, I went to see Frankland, hearing he was such a good astrologer. And he took a look at my chart for a minute, and then he just described what I'd been going through for the past couple of years. And I was astounded. It was accurate. I couldn't see it. And I said, how did you do that? And and Franklin said, well, he's been experimenting with these new techniques, symbolic techniques. And so this guy said, well, can I study with you? And Franklin said, in fact, yes, you're welcome to, because I need an assistant to research charts for me because I'm writing some books on this. And so this client then became a student and a collaborator, a research assistant. Um,
That's
And
wonderful.
yeah, and so his books are short, but they're clearly written and to the point and have a lot of chart examples.
Okay.
Um, and the techniques work. I mean, they're not, nothing's 100% in astrology, but these are very good and usually pretty
Yeah.
accurate. And they often hit
And they're
the,
very approachable too.
you know, oh, the one that I was most skeptical of, but I've seen it work many times, is he used birth numbers, which are
Mm,
come from numerology, which I don't know that much about, where basically you take the numbers in your birth date, you add them up, and it gives you a figure. And then Franklin, what he found in his research was the age generated was usually important, but especially so if there were major astrological things going on in your chart that year. And then they were super important years. And it's really interesting.
I was very interested in the numerology approach there
Mhm.
because I get asked all the time how can people blend numerology with astrology, and I'm like, I don't know. I don't know that much about it, but even just going through these exercises, and I tried that approach, combined with attributing 7 years to each sign, and
Mhm.
even just my birth number very much lines up with a period of life that seems to like it's going to be a lot more active for me
Mhm.
at that age around 39. So
Mhm.
it's frustrating because I'm not there yet. I don't know exactly what's happening, but I see, okay, around my 40s, things are going to pick up, it seems.
Right. Well, what Frank would, he would identify that period, 39, 40, 41, as
Hmm.
a highly significant and active period. And he would get symbolically then look what's it activating in the chart, what planets, what houses do the planets occupy, what do they rule, etc. And then he would look more carefully, what transits are going on, what if you use progressions, directions, solar
Okay.
returns to try to pinpoint it more accurately.
Okay, I like that. Kind of using this as a starting point to see where you should dive deeper, it seems,
Yeah.
is really where the key is. Okay, I need to really just dive into it and see what comes up because this is just so intriguing to me. And
Now,
I've been,
do you use midpoints?
I am just now dipping my toes into midpoints.
Hmm.
But that is another thing where when I was looking along the midpoints of this, especially for the 1 degree
Hmm.
measure and the 4/7 degree measure, midpoints were really starting to help unlock that for me because I don't
Right.
have a ton going on in that particular area of my chart. But
Hmm.
when you factor in midpoints, I was able to see a lot more going on.
Right. The planets involved in the midpoint. He doesn't use them the way, say, Eberton did, to have specific definitions for each one. It's more these two planets are being activated, and what do
Mhm.
they mean, and what are they doing in your birth chart? And that's what to expect. And
Yeah.
also the nature of the planet. If it's, say, Mars and Saturn, that's going to be a difficult period, probably. If it's Venus and Jupiter, that sounds pretty good,
That sounds good. Yeah.
right? Um, but
Wonderful.
it's quite interesting how well they work. Yeah.
And when I was going through, I have a question for you. When I was going through all of your case studies, I am curious on if when a client comes to you and they have a particular question about when is such and such going to happen for me,
Hmm.
what are some good questions that you think this technique might be ideal for? Because a lot of your case studies I noticed, especially in the first part of the book, we're looking at cases where a lot of the times we're leaning towards the time of a person's death. And so I'm like, what are some
Hmm.
other questions that people might really be able to answer with these
right?
techniques.
The death stuff is astrologers writing about prediction like death because it's definitive. There's no
It
question.
is.
Somebody dies, and usually you know the date off and the time. And so it's one of those events that nobody can argue with.
Hmm.
And then if you can show your technique was able to forecast this in advance, that's sort of convincing. It's also dramatic often. Um, and that's part of the literature. It's a little bit morbid, but
It pulls
if you
people
look back
in.
in the older literature, they're always predicting death. Um, but I mean, he does give a lot of examples. I mean, Alan Leo's a good case. He knew Alan Leo. He had met him in London, and he does mention Alan Leo's. He gives his birth numbers. Actually, this is his example of birth. Alan Leo, I think, was born August 7th, 1860, if I remember. That's why he's Leo. He's a Leo. And he had Leo rising in his birth chart, or maybe close to Leo rising, I think.
Hmm.
Or no, it was really Leo. Well, he had a Leo ascendant. I think it might have been the end of Leo. And then I don't remember. But anyway, his birth numbers, he had an initial birth number. He just added all the digits and he got 30. And so, then he looked in Alan Leo's chart and saw there was a lot of other stuff going on at age 30. And so, and they involved, I think, 10th house issues and maybe ninth and third. So this was a year he published his astrological journal that became a cornerstone of modern astrology. It was a major initiation of a publication that is kind of foundational for what we do in astrology as modern astrologers. And that occurred when Alan Leo was 30. So he thought that was quite impressive. And then he does what he calls an additional birth number, where you combine your initial one with your year of birth and reduce that. And he got
Hmm.
57. And I guess he met Alan Leo when Alan Leo was in his 50s, and he was there in London when Alan Leo died. And so this had an impact on him because the 57 birth number, I think he was expecting 57 to be a major year in Alan Leo's life. And certainly death is a major year.
Yeah.
I don't know that that's what he was expecting. So they are impressive. I think there were several other examples that weren't death. I hope it wasn't too. um,
There were a lot of that, but I saw one that one lottery winner,
mhm,
that was one that I recall.
right. Oh, there was the woman who got married and then divorced and was able to see both those years in her chart.
Mhm.
Um,
Is there anything, if someone's coming to you with a question on, can you predict something about my life? What are your ethics surrounding that or your boundaries surrounding that? Is there anything that you would recommend that astrologers not really touch with a client?
well, I think it depends a lot on the client.
Hmm.
I mean, first, I would never say you're going to die this year. That's
Yeah.
just because we don't know. I mean, even
Hmm.
though we might see it'll be a difficult year for health, and I would say that you let me give an example. Actually, recently using this technique, a man contacted me with a question about his son, and his question specifically was he wanted to know what might be happening in his son's career in the next few years. And using Franklin's technique, I looked at the midpoints And they were hitting specifically a Saturn Chiron midpoint. I use Chiron. Um, and to me, Saturn's a traditional malefic. It's some sort of difficulty or obstacle. And Chiron often has to do with being wounded in some way, a hurt,
Mhm.
physical or emotional. And it was affecting his 10th house. So what I said to this man was, and there were a lot of good things going on career-wise too. It looks to me like the next few years he'll do okay. But right now there's this Saturn Chiron midpoint being activated, and the I didn't know anything about the kid,
Mhm.
um, but he had Aries rising, Mars trine Aries, the ascendant, a very prominent Mars. And that made me think this is a very energetic, maybe athletic kid. So I said to the father, there is this somewhat difficult thing going on. And so he needs to be very careful if he plays sports. There's a possibility of some sort of sports related injury or other type of accident with an injury. And so he just tell him to be careful when he's being active physically. And the father interrupted me. I didn't tell you, but yeah, he is a professional athlete. And
Yeah.
he's right now recuperating from a sports injury.
Oh,
So that confirmed I didn't know any of this. I didn't know what the kid was doing. I just had his chart. And to me, that drove home but that's how I would handle it too. You don't
okay.
hide something difficult, but you just say, there's a difficult aspect or progression going on. And in
Hmm.
the chart, it's related to these houses. So the person needs to be careful because he
Okay.
may be somewhat accident prone at this time, or if he's active or into sports, there's a risk of injury. He should be aware of that.
Okay. I really like that advice because you don't want to create a feeling of being very alarmed, but just pointing out, hey, this is a possibility, have some awareness of it, be careful. I think that's a really good approach, it
Well,
seems.
life is full of ups and downs. I have a friend who's an
Hmm.
astrologer. And a few years ago, she called me up and said, I'm really worried about my chart. And the worry was this: she was having severe hip problems, a lot of
Hmm.
pain. And the doctor said, you really need surgery. This is not going to get better. I mean, she was almost immobile. It was hard to walk. And in her return and transit, she was having a lot of squares and oppositions going on, involving the sixth house in particular. And she wanted to know, did I think she should postpone this operation and, maybe wait 6 months or a year? And I looked at her chart and, she was right. There were squares and oppositions and they looked difficult. But what I said to her was, well, isn't this the chart you would expect with its transits and progressions and so on during a period when you were having severe hip pain that required surgery? That's what it's describing. It's not
Hmm.
saying that the outcome will be bad. It's saying you're going through a really hard period. And then we did some elective work and she picked a time to have the surgery and it went well. But
Good.
but the chart reflects what's going on in your life. And
That's true.
if you're having a lot of difficult aspects going on, probably there's difficult stuff going on in your life. But that happens in everybody's life.
Hmm.
And it doesn't mean it's going to have a bad outcome. It's kind of describing what you're going through.
Exactly. Exactly. I think that's definitely important to remember. I think, especially delving more into predictive type of work, it can be easy, especially looking at my own chart. It can be easy to start telling myself stories and I'm definitely a worst case scenario type of thinker when it comes to myself. So
Yeah.
it's really important to remember
Uh,
that there's always ups and downs. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to end badly, but you just gotta write it out.
yeah. I mean, first of all, we call it predictive astrology. We really can't predict. I mean, we can we can predict possibilities reasonably accurately, I think. Like this will be a difficult period, this will be a fun
Mm,
period. Um, but it's almost impossible to predict specifics, I think. And usually the more specific you try to get, the more inaccurate you get.
yeah.
But if you stick with the more archetypal, not so much vague, but you can describe something that's very accurate but not specific. Well, like with my friend,
Exactly.
I said, you know, it does look like a period with a lot of physical ailments, but you can barely walk and you're having severe pain all the time. Wouldn't that show up in your chart? uh, if she had all trines and sextiles and nothing involving the sixth house, and you'd think the chart is wrong. It's got to show what she's going through.
Exactly.
Um,
And what you say about leaning into and thinking about the archetypes of it and the generalities of it, I definitely noticed that when you were describing in the book, just the process of William Frankland interpreting the chart about the missing person and oh, he has such and such going on in Capricorn. It must have happened around an industrial
mhm,
barren type of place because that lines up with Capricorn
yeah,
archetypes. And I was just reading that and just, I almost couldn't wrap my mind around it because it was just so simple and so general, but it worked.
right. Well, that's what I like about Franklin. It sounds like what he's saying is so simple, but when
Hmm.
you think about it, is really very profound.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm.
I was very interested in that case, and I posed the question to the group. It made me think about, I don't know if it's real or not, or if it's just a myth or a legend, but you hear these stories about detectives or police departments or the US government using people like psychics, mediums
Hmm.
for missing persons cases. I don't know exactly the truth to that, but I was thinking, what about astrologers? Do you think as astrology becomes more socially acceptable, that could be something that we get into using astrology to help cases like this more?
That's a good question. I don't know.
Yeah.
Um, I do know astrologers who have consulted to police, but it's not a common occurrence, and police are
Hmm.
probably not likely to consult astrologers. They do
Yeah.
consult psychics, interestingly. Um, Years ago, and I hope I remember this correctly, I did a workshop with Gilbert Navarro, who's a horary astrologer, who
Hmm.
had trained with Ivy Goldstein Jacobson. Jacobson Goldstein? Ivy Goldstein Jacobson. I don't know if you know her. She's deceased now, but she was a very well-known horary astrologer in the United States several decades ago. She wrote a book that was very influential, and she was quite a gifted astrologer. And he told the story. And now this workshop I took probably in the 1980s, so it's a while ago.
Hmm.
But I remember he talked about the 1990s, maybe. There was a kidnapping in California that was quite well known. I don't know if it was a while ago, though. It was the Chowchilla kidnapping. And what happened was there was an outing by a group of little kids from the school. And then the bus disappeared. No, the kids just disappeared. They were kidnapped, and the police couldn't find the bus. And they were searching, and this was in the news. And I don't know if he or one of his students did a horror chart. Uh, where are these missing kids that have been kidnapped? And there are techniques in horary which allow you to estimate a direction and a distance. And so they came up, I don't remember what they found, but it was a certain number of miles in a certain direction from where the bus was last seen.
Mhm.
And they thought this was important enough that they notified the police. It turned out they were fairly accurate. Eventually, the bus was found very near the location they had specified from the horror chart. But then they felt like they became suspects, like they had something to do
Oh,
with the
oh no.
kidnapping. Uh, so I think that's one of the risks of if you're accurate, since most astrologers can't believe it's possible to do that.
Mhm.
Um,
You could potentially be putting yourself out there as a potential suspect.
yeah, especially if you're
Okay,
right.
that makes a lot of sense. That's unfortunate, but I really think that's something, I don't know, true crime is very popular
Mhm.
genre for podcasts, YouTube, television, all of that. It
Well,
seems
horror is weird because the chart really has to be asked by a person who is involved in the matter in a very
okay.
personal way and has a pressing interest in getting the answer.
Okay.
Otherwise, it's just a random question.
Hmm.
So, how do you assure that you have a genuine horror chart and just not the question somebody's asking?
Exactly.
Um,
Hmm. Well, it's fun to explore, but maybe not the right time for it anytime soon. I was getting excited. Maybe I could have my Nancy Drew moment
mhm.
someday as a Nancy Drew astrologer, but we'll put it on the back burner for now.
But certainly, if something happened to you or a family member of yours, then it would be a very valid horror question, and
Hmm.
you would probably get a very valid answer.
Okay. That's a good point. Okay. Let me see what other questions we have. I was curious because I am still working through the book. Do you teach any workshops ever on this topic or teach any courses ever on this topic?
No, I haven't.
You haven't?
Well,
Would
the
are
book
you
just
have you
came out.
considered?
I've given talks, but not,
Okay.
just lectures, not workshops, and I
Hmm.
haven't taught a course. At this point, I'm not, but it would be interesting to do.
Yeah, it would be. Yeah,
So,
because I was following along and it's it's easy enough to do it along the book, but I do sometimes like more of a structured learning
mhm,
style. And so I was just curious, because I think working through it in that type of setting would really help unlock it even more for people, or even just I was going through this and I was like, wow, I wish I could bring it back to middle school math and just have
mhm,
little worksheets.
yeah, that's a good idea. I mean, the book just came out the beginning of the
Hmm.
year, so
Okay,
and I'm still learning. I mean, I've read Frankland.
exactly.
But every time I use his technique, I'm sort of like, oh wow, that's
Hmm.
quite amazing.
How long did it take you to write this book?
Probably a couple of years. I
A
mean,
couple years. Okay.
yeah, because I read through Franklin, worked through a lot of examples, and I was, I kept getting blown away. I said, it doesn't seem like it should work. And then I would look at several charts and say, oh my God, it works in every one of them. And
Just the continual
yeah,
amazement is wonderful, and just unlocking it, and it's a good feeling. And just reading through it is a large book, but for anyone out there who's intimidated by the size of the book. It is very easy to understand, and at first I was still extremely confused. I'm like,
Hmm.
even just basic math sometimes but as you continue reading it and working through the case studies, it
Hmm.
does eventually start to unlock more and more.
Right.
So,
There's simple techniques, but you have to apply them in charts that
mhm,
you know, and then you see how well they work.
exactly, exactly. Okay, Anthony, it seems like those are all of our questions. We have one comment from Maria who says we answered one of hers, so that's wonderful.
Mhm.
Thank you for watching. Do you have anything else you'd like to add before we come to a close?
Let me think. I think we covered the basics.
Okay.
As I said earlier, a thing that really impressed me was his bringing midpoints into English speaking Western astrology.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know of anyone else who did. Charles Carter, who was a very well known British astrologer, I don't think mentioned them in any of his books until maybe the late 1920s, early 1930s. And then when the German stuff got taken over into English and cosmobiology, they've mushroomed. And they're a very powerful technique, but Franklin was using them. I guess the thing I didn't we didn't talk about was Franklin's approach to a chart was he always started with the birth chart and thought that was
Mm-hmm.
essential to always have in front of you, which is very traditional.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
But then he would study the birth chart for what are the major things going on in this chart. So step back and get a global picture. What houses are most emphasized, what aspects are most emphasized. Are there? He was particularly interested in the T squares, or what do you call them, grand crosses,
Mm-hmm.
because like the midpoint school, the Iranian school, he found that the hard aspects tend to be the ones that manifest. That the soft
Exactly.
aspects you may feel, your life may be more comfortable, but they generally don't show up as an event in your life. The events really tend to be hard aspect phenomena.
We tend to have more awareness around
Yeah,
the uncomfortable things in life than
yeah.
we do around the comfy things in life, especially.
But then he also looked at the midpoint. So if you had say a T square, he'd look at anything 45 degrees from those planets in all directions. And if those points got hit, even though there's nothing there, the midpoint is there. And that would
Mhm.
trigger the whole picture, the whole complex. And and he could do this quickly and say, oh, it looks like at age 39, big year, and these are the things I think are going to happen. And he was very,
Mhm.
very good. I mean, once he practiced it, he could do it quickly, and his clients were astounded. How did you know?
Wow. Okay, so really, well, thank you to Franklin for bringing midpoints and making them more of a standard, especially because even just exploring midpoints, it really just unlocks the chart and allows you to look at things from an entirely new perspective. And even just using these techniques, I do have, um, some midpoints on those harder aspects within my chart. And it's
Mhm.
really intriguing just being able to use these techniques and seeing that, oh, when I'm around 47, that particular midpoint and that aspect is going to get hit. And yeah, it's very intriguing. There's a lot to it. And it just lights up my curiosity.
Okay, so I guess as well, I hope people are enjoying the book. And
I think they are. We've had some good discussion, especially within the last week. And Anthony, is there anywhere people can follow you to continue following your work or to
Well,
get
I
in
do
touch
have
with you?
a blog that I keep up periodically. It's not regular, but I do post. It's in WordPress, and if you look Tony Lewis WordPress, you'll find it.
Okay. Tony Lewis WordPress.
Right.
Okay. And well, thank you, Anthony, for joining us for this Q&A. And it was a pleasure reading this book, very enlightening and intriguing. And thank you to all of our group members watching and those who participated in the group discussions throughout the month. For June, we'll be reading Classical Solar Returns by Lee Lehman. So discussions will start next week. June 8th is when we'll make the discussion post on the first three chapters. So leave a comment below if you're planning to read along, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Bye,
Okay.
Anthony.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you.